Welcome back to Don't Wing It. Today is a special day because it's interview day. I'm doing one interview a month. And today's interview, y'all have been waiting and just been on pins and needles, just waiting for it to happen. And today I have Kim Stewart with me. Kim, welcome to Don't Wing It.
Thanks, Ren. I'm so glad to be here and serve your listeners.
Oh my goodness, this is great. You serve so well. And that's one of the prerequisites that I have to come on my show is that you offer value, and you are quintessential for offering value no matter where they find you on your podcast, Book Marketing Mania, or on your email or on your social media. You offer value. So I am super excited for you to join me today talking about podcast pitching.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. I can't wait to get into it.
Okay. So what you do is you help authors or others that have their own ministry or business, that you help them to pitch themselves, their talk, their message to other podcasters. And so I think it's so great because it's a niche that is much needed, because as we know, the best way to grow our own podcast is to guest on other people's podcast. And so I want to talk through that, and we're going to kind of go a little. Well, the first thing, let's go ahead and get this out of the way, because I know people are listening and they're like, okay, I don't have a podcast yet. I'm going to get coached by Ren, wink, wink.
Yeah.
But I don't have a podcast yet, but how can I pitch to be on somebody else's podcast when I don't have a podcast? So what would you say is just, we're going to go ahead and jump right into this. And what would you say to them?
If they want to be a guest on somebody else's podcast to reach
and they
their
don't
target
have
audience, and they don't have a, which is fine. You could do that, right? I mean, you can do it before you have a podcast. You can do it before you have a book. You can do it before you have anything, as long as you have a message on your heart that's going to serve people well. So yeah, I would just, the best thing for me is to build relationships ahead of time, which I know Ren's big on that too. And that just goes a little bit, goes a long way in a podcaster's mind. So I really encourage people to spend some time getting to know the podcast host they might want to pitch, and then just reach out. And it depends on where you're at with your relationship. You know, it might be something super casual and you're just able to send a short DM to them, or it might be something a little more formal. Maybe they have a form on their website and you definitely want to be respectful of that and fill out their form, or you might send them an email. And I know after doing this for several years that in our attention spans that hosts want to see shorter and shorter emails. So like you really want to get to the point of what you're reaching out for. And it is to serve the audience always. So always go into it with a servant's heart, on your mind. And if you don't do anything else, like just let them know you would love to serve their audience. And this is how. So, and I would do like a brief sentence about yourself. It doesn't have to be this big, long story about you, because it's really about the listeners. And so you can just do like a 1-sentence introduction to yourself if they don't know who you are. If somebody can refer you, or you can make mention of a past episode or something like that, is great. But you don't even have to do that, I don't think, nowadays, because again, I think people want shorter and they just want you to get to the point of how you're going to serve their listeners. And so I always encourage, just share a topic. If you've already looked at the show and they haven't covered it, share a topic and maybe give like 3 talking points and give like 1 link to either your media page or your website. And just keep it really short and brief, because that's all they want to be able to open up their email, see what value are you bringing to my show? What are you asking for? And make it really clear that you're wanting to be a guest on their podcast. And then how can they check you out online, and then leave it in their hands. Then they can go check you out. But at least you've done the heavy lifting. I think of the biggest thing is just, what topic do you want to bring to their listeners, and make sure it's, for their show. It's not just like this blanket topic that could be on any show. You really want it to be about the show you're pitching. And I think that's what's working really well today to do that. And again, it's just, they don't have to be scared about it or anxious or anything, and don't procrastinate, just get going. If you have a God-given message on your heart, then listeners are there and they want to hear it.
Yes. And I tell people when they reach out, I send them to you, because when they're like, hey, how do I pitch to get on somebody's podcast? I don't have a podcast yet. I'm coming to you later, Ren. I just can't, I don't know what to do first and without a podcast. And I send them to you because I know what not to do, but you are so good about that. And I love how you said, don't send a blanket email, because of the fact that the blanket email, we can smell that. Podcasters can smell that a mile away. So I love the conciseness that you said, the being concise and saying a little bit about yourself, and that you're always focused on the listener. Yes, yes,
Yes,
Kim, that's so
always.
good, so good. And the connection beforehand. I mean,
Mhm.
that's how it happens, is the connections. And I think that's how I filled my beta course. Is I've had connections with those women for years on Instagram
Yeah,
alone, and
yeah.
so it's so important. So thank you for doing that and telling us that big, huge value, because that is really important. So thanks for
Mhm.
let's getting that out in the open and sharing with my listeners about how to do that. That's awesome. Okay. So now let's jump into kind of what we are talking a swap, a
Mhm.
podcast swap. So, first, let's talk about what it is. So, tell us,
Mhm.
what is a podcast swap?
Yeah. So a podcast swap is we're going to have two people that have a podcast, and they could have totally different kind of podcasts, but they're both podcast hosts. So when you want to pitch to be a guest on another podcast, you're able to offer the swap and say, I'm wanting to come on your show to serve your listeners in this way. And in return, I'd love for you to come on my show and serve my listeners in this way. And it's just a really great thing to do, like, especially nowadays, like used to, this wasn't a big of a deal because there weren't as many podcasts. And, it was just easier, I think, quote unquote, easier, to be a guest because people were looking for guests. But I think now we have so many incredible online communities and people are getting to know each other. And so they may not even be looking for guests because they always are finding somebody within their community to be on their show. But it's like, I think when we receive a pitch, we immediately think, okay, someone wants to advertise something on my show,
Mhm.
And I mean, we really do. Like, even if that's not the case, that's what we think, right? Because we have worked
Right.
really hard to build an audience and we want to be faithful to our audience and what we promise to them. So that is what kind of goes into our minds. So you have to think about that on the other podcaster side, as you are truly wanting to advertise something, on somebody else's show. And so how can you, give back in return for that? Because it's such an honor to get to be a guest on somebody's show, and it's hard work on a podcaster, so we
Yeah.
want to make sure we give something back. So I think that's always a nice thing if you can do it, and it has to always be in alignment. I mean, I know, Ren, you talk about this a lot too, and
Yeah.
you have to make sure that who you're swapping with is in alignment, right? You wouldn't want to go get on a show that you're not, your listeners are not your target audience
Sure.
necessarily. And then you want to make sure that the hosts that you're swapping with, that they're going to serve your audience well, and it's a good match. But I think it's a nice way. You don't always have to do that, but I think
Yeah.
it's a super great way to, serve each other's communities,
Yeah.
and get, make your reach go even further. And then, a lot of my clients that have done this, or just even guest period, they just say, the relationship with another host just far exceeds anything they do in book sales or email list
Mhm.
growth. You just, those relationships, they just go on and on and on, and you just never know what God has in store for that. So yeah,
Mm.
I love swaps for sure. Yeah.
That's so good. So good. Okay. So there are a few prerequisites for a swap, because number one, you have to have a podcast, two people that have podcasts, right? And then you have to have a podcast that has interviews. Or
Mhm.
even if you are a solo entrepreneur or a solo podcaster, then you might want to toss in an interview once in a while. Like me, I'm usually doing mostly monologues,
Mhm.
but I have decided to put in an interview just to mix it up a little bit with the format. And so I do
Mhm.
that maybe once a month. And so that's the second prerequisite. You need to have a podcast that has interviews, or at least lean into that
Yeah.
once in a while. And then number three, what would you add to that? Like, what's another prerequisite to have a podcast swap?
Well, I think so. If you're offering up a swap or you're looking for a podcast to swap with, you're going to go check out their show. And I think the most important thing too, like, okay, they have a podcast, obviously, they have some interviews, obviously, so they'd be open to some guest swaps. But I think the next thing is just like making sure they're a current show, because a lot of
Mm,
times I know people will screenshot shows and send them to me to vet them for them. And it's like, the show hasn't put out an episode and, however long, this is not a current show. We're not going to pitch them. So I think making sure you are, current, that you've had an episode, like at least within like the last 30 days. And if
yeah.
not, and I think Randy, you may have an episode on this, but if not, like if you're on a break, then like put an episode up there that you're on a break, just let me know, like, you're on a break and you're going to return at XYZ time. So I think that's important anytime, just to make sure you're current with your podcast. And then number 4, I would say be consistent too. Like, like let me see, like if I scroll down your episodes, I can tell, okay, she shows up every 2 weeks or she shows up every month or every week. Like, I just make it be really obvious. This is this is a show that interviews guests. They're consistent, they're current. Then yeah, this is definitely something I wanted to, vet a little bit further to swap with.
That's good. That's really good. I like that, checking them out. And that's for us to do no matter if we have a podcast or not. So definitely look at that, see if they're current, for sure. For sure. I love that. Okay. So those are the prerequisites for a podcast swap. So let's say that you are the person, you have a podcast, or the podcast that you're wanting to pitch to does have interviews, even if it's just once in a while. They are current, they have posted, you can see that. And then maybe you have listened to their episode, so that they're listeners, that you can provide them value. Okay. So let's talk a little deeper with a swap. How do you pick who you swap with? Because this, I think, is really, really important.
It is. Yeah. You definitely want to make sure that the audience is who you want to serve, right? I mean, it doesn't, well, I shouldn't say it doesn't make sense. It just depends on what your goal is with podcast guesting, podcasting, podcast swapping. Make sure that it's in alignment with your goal, that the show you're looking at, when you vet them, that their listeners are who you would want to connect with, right? That's the audience you want to serve. And, then vice versa, they'll be looking at the same for you. So you definitely want to look at what your goals are for doing this in the first place, and then make sure, is that audience going to support that? So, if I'm trying to market my book or build my email list, or, there's just all different ways you can grow, by podcast guesting, but I would just make sure that audience that you're wanting to reach is going to meet that goal. Now, and in addition to that, I always make sure it's about the listeners, but I will say, in addition to that, because we are in business, that sometimes it's the host. Like I say, my clients, that's the biggest thing that they see the biggest return is those relationships that have gone on to incredible things, co-writing books together, masterminding together, all kinds of things. Is I would say sometimes the target is the host, right? You're wanting to really connect with that host and serve their audience well, but it's really your goal is that connection. But again, I would still say your topic that you're serving is, has to make sense for their show. So I think that's super important, is really to look at the listeners first and then look at the host and make sure that makes sense for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can see how this would flip flop as well for you're inviting people to come on your show. I think it works both ways, is that you've got to make sure that it's in alignment. I got fired up yesterday on Instagram stories because I was just thinking about how when we invite people on our show, or if we pitch ourselves to someone else, or do a podcast swap, we have to be in alignment. Like, it can't be like, I'm not a health coach, and then, like, say I'm a health coach, and then I have somebody coming on to talk about how to start their business or something, like it's got to be aligned. It has to be, it can't be just us selfishly wanting to connect with somebody, unless it have to do with that listener and offering value. So, I think that's good to remember, of the alignment. That's really good. That's really good. Okay. So let's kind of go a little bit. How would you reach out? You mentioned this a little bit earlier, through, it depends on kind of what the person, like the relationship you have. What are the best ways that you've seen that your clients have reached out to do a podcast swap with someone? How has that worked? What has worked well?
I think a couple of different ways. Like, and again, it depends on the relationship you have with the host, how you're reaching out to them. But, you could be I work with a lot of authors that are releasing their books, or that you might be an entrepreneur with a program you're launching, so you've kind of are in a specific time frame. And so you're pitching yourself to guests in these different places. Like, that's kind of your goal without even thinking about a swap. But then if you realize, oh, this is a great swapper opportunity, then you could either pitch the swap right away, like just open up with, hey, I wanted to see if you might be open to a guest swap, and I would love for you to come serve my audience. Always put in their, always put them first. Who you're trying to pitch. Let them know what it's in it for them, and then I'd love to come serve your audience. So you could straight up do it. Now, I will say, when you do that, there's always a chance, like if they aren't up for a swap, then they may not even be up to having you on their show. So it just depends again on that relationship, or I may just do a pitch. Like I would just pitch to be a guest, but then I'll mention like further down, maybe like at the, the end of my hopefully quick email, just,
Yeah.
hey, I would also be open to having you on my show if you're interested, so it's
Yeah.
like you're getting your pitch in there first, but then you're also mentioning you'd be open to some some guest swap opportunities. So I just think
Good.
keep it super casual, but go ahead and
Okay.
mention it if you are up for it.
Yeah.
I definitely would go ahead and put it out there.
That's good. That's really good. Okay. So tell us, let's go a little deeper. I'm all about practicality and things. So
Mhm.
tell us an example of when you had a client that did a pitch or a swap, either way, that went well. And what do you think were the main things? Like, tell us what kind of business they were in, or if it was a book they were launching, and
Mhm.
then how that went.
Yeah. So I've got one client that she is an author, but she's also a coach, an online coach. So she has two sides of her business. And so that's what we kind of did with her is like there was some host we were pitching that I just knew like I was like, we're gonna have to offer a swap ahead of time. Like we were just
Okay.
gonna need to offer that up. But we
Okay.
really were good about looking at the other hosts, like what did they have going on? What,
Mhm.
what is their show about? And then we just were like, it's almost like you're pitching, you're being really personalized in your pitch to be a guest, but at the same time, you're also personalizing the opportunity you want to present to them for the swap. So I think that's really important too, is like go to them with what you want them to talk about on your show. So they don't have to think
Yes.
about it. Like they don't have to spend any time thinking about, is this a
Yes.
great deal? So that's worked out well for one of my clients that like set it like a 90-day time frame she was going to pitch in. And so we just did that as we knew that like, okay, these hosts were definitely going to pitch a swap. And so that's worked really well because she's marketing her book, she's marketing a course and coaching, but also, she's just really big on building the relationships and having really great guests on her own show to create content, to put out. So it's worked
Mhm.
really well for her. Yeah.
Okay. And so she emailed, she reached out, and
Mhm.
then they responded
Mhm.
what, quickly or within the week?
Yeah, yeah. I think really quick. Yeah. And the other thing, I think we've probably talked about this, and actually, I'm going to give a shout out because Ren was my guest on Book Marketing Mania episode 35, and we talked about,
So
just
good.
again building the relationships. It was a really great episode on all different ways you can podcast. And Ren, you gave some great tips from all your years of experience on how to pitch and how not to pitch and how to build relationships. And
Yeah.
one thing I really encourage people to do is like leave a review of a show you're going to pitch. And so that's something
Yes.
else like we always kind of throw in is like let them know that you left a review. So I did just want to mention that, but
Yes.
I say that and I've already forgotten what question you just asked me.
Well, I was just going to ask you, like, did they get back with them after they did the pitch
Yes,
in an email? They
yes.
got back with them
Yeah.
fairly regular. I
Yeah,
mean,
we
fairly
almost
quickly.
always hear back, pretty
Okay.
quickly. It depends on their,
Okay.
sometimes we'll follow up and then they're like, "Oh,
Yes.
sorry, it got lost in my inbox." Or,
Yes.
and everybody's so sweet. I've really, as long as you're not
Yeah.
hounding them, podcast hosts have been really great. But yeah, and I think a
Yeah.
few of them were really surprised that they had that opportunity, like that you're
Yeah.
coming, you're presenting this opportunity to me as well as, pitching to be a guest. And I think it really surprises people that you're
Mm.
open to, having them on your platform for sure.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned your episode that we talked about on episode 35. Y'all need to go listen to it. She has an excellent podcast. Kim does. So I'll put that in the show notes. But for sure with the whole I love that they're surprised by that, and because it's your offering, but then it's truly being a swap, where you do this and I'll do this, and it's gonna help both of us. And so
Mhm.
and I love that you said one thing that I would say is my inbox does get rather full. And so
Mhm.
if you have sent someone an email, I always want to be like, send me a second one, please.
Mhm.
Like send
Yeah,
me,
yeah.
obviously after the second or the third, hopefully that person, that podcaster has gotten back with you and said, hey, I
Mhm.
can't do it now, but what about then or whatever. But definitely reach back out a second or third time. Then after three, you can, move
Mhm.
on. But I definitely think that's a good strategy to use because we, especially as highly creative people, we
Mhm.
forget that we looked at the email and didn't respond.
Yeah.
because we
Yeah.
looked at it on our phone or whatever and then didn't
Yeah,
respond. So
absolutely.
that's
Yeah, we do that
that's
all
a
the
good tip.
time. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
too, like if you're focused on the relationships, like if you have built a relationship with
Mm,
somebody online, then I think it's okay like to pop in a DM and just what I say is just
yes.
like confirm. I just wanted to confirm
Mhm.
how you have guest submissions, like don't go through your whole
Mhm.
pitch, but just kind of, poking them and then they might be like, "Oh gosh, I remember seeing your name in inbox. I'm sorry." Or they
Totally.
might be like, "Oh yeah, you got to just fill out this form and then you didn't know that." So it's sometimes
Yeah.
it's nice to do that, to just kind of hit them up that way as well.
Oh, it's totally. And
Yeah.
I am exhibit A. Like, please do that because Ren
Yeah.
will forget. So I think that's great. How can a podcaster become swap worthy? Like, what are the steps they need to take? Like, as a podcaster themselves, what
Yeah.
needs to be swap worthy for
Yeah, I
them?
think I would say number one to host a really great show, and that doesn't mean like has to be a huge show, has to have a lot of listeners and downloads. Nothing about that. It's just that you're
Yeah.
really showing up to serve your listeners well. And all of you that are listening to Ren's show, you have no excuse, right? I mean, just you follow her strategies that she shares.
Yeah.
Because it's
Yeah.
so important to just really know why you're podcasting, what your mission is with the podcast, how you're serving your listeners, and then just show up, consistently and do that really well. And that's what I say. So the first thing I would say is host a great show, whatever that means to you. And
Yeah.
second, like we talked about earlier, just, being consistent. And again, it's whatever is consistent for you. And I know Ren preaches this a lot. It's your show and it's really how can you show up consistently and truly show up every time, and not miss if you can help it. So I think that's the second thing is just making sure you are being consistent. And if something
Mhm.
happens, just communicate it with your listeners. They're totally
Yes.
fine with it. They just want to know,
Yep.
if the show doesn't show up on my player anymore, what happens? So that's number two. And then
Yep.
number three, I would also say to ask your listeners for reviews because again, it doesn't matter the number. In my mind, it doesn't matter the number of reviews you have, but
Mhm.
it is helpful if somebody's going to look at a show that they
Yeah.
might see, have you had a review recently? Like, I'm really surprised. Like it
Mm.
might be 2 or 3 years ago and they may have a ton of reviews, but it's like the most recent was 2 or 3 years ago. Then you kind of wonder, well, they don't have a very engaged audience,
Mm.
if they're not getting anyone to review their show recently. So I think that's
Good.
important. It's always important to ask for that feedback, but I think
Yeah.
again, with a swap worthy mindset, it's just
Yeah.
thinking, okay, when somebody comes and checks out my show, will they see a review that's been, in the
Mhm.
last month? I think that's really helpful.
That's so good. These all are really, really good. Hosting a great show, being consistent, asking listeners for reviews even later as you are podcasting,
Mhm.
recently. That's good. That's really good.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
love
And
that.
I'll say one more thing, and you're really good about this, Ren. So you said an awesome example of this, and I know you do talk about it on your show of how to market your podcast. But I would say if you're on social media,
Mhm.
it's like to have some kind of a social proof on your show. Like if I
Mhm.
go find you on social media, am I going to see anything about your podcast?
Yeah.
And are you mentioning it? And are you sharing your guest and guest episodes? And just
Mhm.
are people talking about your show? Because that's what I'm so surprised about too. Is like people,
Mhm.
will see somebody post a show and they'll send me a screenshot and they're like, do you know this podcast? Or, or they, just like, I'm thinking about adding this to my pitch list and they don't even go look at it. They're just like, they see it on social and it's that immediately,
Wow.
like you see somebody guesting on a show and it's like, oh, wow,
Yeah.
I've got, that FOMO, I've got to get on that show too. So I think
Yes.
just, having some social proof going on is really important too.
That's good. That's good. Yeah. Well, do you have a download or something how we can get on your email list or tell us where we can have those resources? Because I know that you have invaluable resources for us. So tell us
Yeah.
one or two of those resources.
Okay. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my podcast again because I've learned so much from Ren and I love podcasting. And my podcast is
Good.
Book Marketing Mania. So if you
Mhm.
hop over there, you're going to find all kinds of episodes
Mhm.
about guesting and podcast hosting with people like Ren that shares, all kinds of fun ways you can host a podcast. So don't get locked into one way or the highway. Like there's just so many cool
Mm.
ways you can use a podcast to grow your business. And then second, I have a Jumpstart Your Podcast Pitching freebie. It's just a short training that you can just, get a little bit under your belt of what to do and start pitching yourself. And that's at kimstewartmarketing.com/jumpstart. And I know Ren will put the link in for y'all.
I will. I will put it in there. That it sounds amazing. And really, Kim is the guru about pitching, and she has a ton of experience with this. and she has a lot of success stories. And so definitely go get that freebie and listen to her podcast. She offers amazing value and has really specific people on. You know how we talked about earlier in the episode about being aligned, and you really spend a good deal of getting people that are aligned to you. And so I love that about you, and I appreciate you coming on the show. So tell us where we can find you online.
Yeah, I would love to connect with you at my website, kimstewartmarketing.com, and you'll see links for everywhere else we can sync up. I'd love to hear from you. And I know that everybody loves your podcast, Ren, just like I do. So don't wing it, turn to Ren for help.
Thank you so much. And y'all go check out Kim and connect with her. She's a great person to connect with. And I thank you so much for your time and your valuable knowledge and wisdom that you have given us a glimmer of today. And I really appreciate you, Kim.
Thanks, Ren.